Prior to the referendum in 2016, we published a paper that looked at the different options in terms of what would the impact be for the climate and energy sector of Brexit. And since then, after the referendum, we published another paper that looks at much more detail at some specific sectors. And one of these is on Euratom. So what I will do is I'll just talk through some of the issues in terms of timetabling where we are. I'll touch upon a couple of the non-nuclear energy issues, and those that are particularly pertinent to Denmark, and then go through some of the issues around Euratom. So firstly, the timetable. You probably can't see it, but it's just worth... I mainly do this slide for the UK because they often forget this bit at the bottom, which is actually the European processes that are going on. So those people that look at Brexit are quite obsessed by it, and it fills the day, but we forget that there's other things going on in the EU. But just for your information, there's two key issues. There's the first, the discussions around how we leave the EU, and that has been going on since Article 50 was triggered, so over a year ago. And the UK government is still to present to the EU actually what it wants, so it makes the negotiations slightly difficult. But the idea is that they've reached some sort of political agreement, and by October of this year, that will come to a final agreement. And then at the same time, they will present a framework for the future relationship. And these are two separate deals. The first thing on exiting the EU only has to be agreed by the UK government, the European Council, the UK Parliament and the European Parliament. But the future deal relationship has to be approved by all parliaments in every member state. And that's where it becomes interesting, I think, from an energy and climate perspective, is it becomes a much more public issue. It's not just the elites discussing this. This is a issue that can affect a more number of people. So that's why I mentioned that. And at the moment, the idea is that we leave at the end of March 2019. It's almost certain, but this is part of the leaving agreement, that there will be a transitional agreement until the end of 2020, in which the UK will continue to apply to EU laws, which will include Euratom, and it means that any new law that is adopted has to pass into UK law. And then now, in the last couple of days, we've been hearing that there may be an additional transition period. So there's a transitional period on the transitional period in order for us to sort out customs. And we still don't know what that means, but you can see that this is an incredibly complex issue. And it's just worth mentioning. I mean, I've worked, as Dorte mentioned, we've been working on energy and nuclear issues in the EU for a couple of decades. But it's only when you talk about leaving that you really understand the complexities and how interlinked things are. So anyway, that's the general overview. And as I said, the bit at the bottom is quite important because as in the midst of the negotiations for leaving, the EU is going to have its European elections. So the European Parliament and the European Commission will be re-elected. And so there's other issues to be addressed. So I guess I've covered most of these things in terms of that there's two deals. The first is the withdrawal deal. Interestingly, so next week in the UK Parliament, there will be... oh no, I'll come on to that later. Firstly, so as I mentioned, we have the ratification issues for leaving, and then we have the future relationship. The European Commission is highlighting it's issuing these called notifications to stakeholders. And anyone who's interested in Euratom, they're worth looking at, because what they are is saying and it's across a whole range of sectors, that these are the impacts of Brexit on you as a stakeholder, be it an industry, be it government, etc. And it's laying out very clearly what are the implications. So they've done one on Euratom. They did that in early this year, and it said look particularly at these areas: the supply agency that was mentioned, the export of nuclear materials, nuclear safety standard, and movement of workers. So we'll come on to these. So they're agreeing with Dorte and myself that these are the key areas that we need to note. Again, just to note from a Danish perspective, and I was meeting some people yesterday here in Copenhagen, they issued a notification to stakeholders yesterday on customs unions. And so this has particular importance in terms of certification of origin, but we can talk about that later, maybe. So anyway, the discussion is underway on how we leave the EU, and then the question on the future relationship. It's probably also just worth mentioning that in the whole of the debate around Brexit in the UK, there wasn't really any mention of climate, and there was no mention of energy. So you can't argue that this was a decision that was driven in this area. It was driven by immigration, it was driven by misinformation, it was driven by issues about budgets, it was driven by parliamentary control. So a whole series of issues that we know affected it, but what we do know is that energy and climate really weren't part of that discussion. We also know that energy will continue to flow irregardless of the relationship. For example, if the UK falls out and there's a no deal, we go to WTO standards, there are no tariffs on electricity, there's a 0.7% tariff on gas, so it's not a tariff issue, it's a regulatory issue. The only way in which things wouldn't flow is on nuclear issues. So there we have a very specific thing, there's no WTO to fall back on. If we don't have an international agreement, then nuclear materials stop flowing. So that's what they are working towards. The next thing just to mention is again, from a climate perspective, the European Council has invited the Commission to present in the first quarter of 2019 long-term objectives. So this is an interesting, and again, just goes to the point that the EU is developing its own plans, continuing on regardless of Brexit, of course, but this is a strategically quite important point within the next cycle. It will be about setting longer-term 2050, but also 2030 plans. So climate and energy continues to evolve regardless of the UK. So why does Brexit lead to Brexitum? And Dorte mentioned this in terms of the Article 106. This is a legal reason why we must leave. And it was interesting, actually. Most of the nuclear industry didn't think we would leave Euratom. So even after the vote, it wasn't until the government published its white paper and then they sent the letter, the Article 50 letter, we were in discussions and they were saying, oh no. And then you can look on the web, there's lots of legal opinions of why the UK would not have to leave Euratom. But I think the Article 106 makes it clear. But then there's also important issues from a UK perspective. From a regulation perspective, one of the arguments in the referendum was that we would take back control. So the idea would be we would not have Brussels making decisions. So therefore, if we remained if we were leaving the EU, then we wouldn't come under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, but then you can't be part of the EU legal frameworks. So from a regulatory perspective, we couldn't be, and from a political perspective, as it was mentioned in terms of Euratom and not being able to be part of one but not part of the other. It's also an institutional question, the idea that if we remain part of Euratom, we'd have European Parliament members, UK Euratom parliamentarians or council members. So it was obvious to most people, but interestingly, not to many people in the nuclear industry. So Dorte went through these. So these are the clear issues in terms of the notification and the Article 50 letter declaring we will be leaving. The key issues, again, that has been mentioned, why we have the Euratom Treaty, what are the areas that are covered by this, and then just the specific considerations for this. So I'll just run through this, but just before touching upon that, just missed out 2 slides that I wanted to include, but I'll just talk it through. Just before we go into the details of the Euratom Treaty, the other area that is worth thinking about from an energy perspective in Denmark, and it comes to the question of regulation, is will the UK still be part of the internal energy market or not? And there is important reasons why it would like to be, in terms of continuing to trade electricity across the borders. The UK will continue to trade electricity, but the key issue about the evolving of European legislation is for more and more harmonisation and more automation in terms of moving electricity through the interconnectors. So the idea, I mean, it's moving so that you have computers, so it's algorithms that are trading electricity across the borders. So the interconnectors eventually will be as simple as trading electricity from within one country. And that is the movement that we are, that's the journey in some ways that the EU is under. So the question is, as we leave, will the UK continue to have access to that? Will it still be part of the internal energy market? And it comes a bit back to the question of this regulatory environment. Will we accept the European Court of Justice? Will we accept laws that are made in Brussels that we no longer have a say in? That's not about taking back control. But this is important, in particular in relation to interconnectors, and why I mention this in terms of Denmark, is there is a proposal to build an interconnector, the Viking Link, between Denmark and the UK. In actual fact, the UK has a smaller number of interconnectors than other countries within the EU. So we have 7% of our peak demand can be met by interconnectors. The EU has a requirement that it needs to be 10%. Prior to Brexit, we were planning to build another 8 interconnectors. 3 of those are under construction, and then there's another 3 that are at advanced stage of planning, 2 of which are from France and the Danish one. Those 3 are suspended at the moment. The French ones are suspended because of Brexit. The Danish one is suspended because of planning issues. But the reason that there is uncertainty about this is if you can't have these interconnectors operated in a very synchronized way, their value diminishes. So their economic value is less. So this is why, if you're building interconnectors, you're very concerned about Brexit. So I just raise that this is potentially a Danish issue, because obviously if you don't build an interconnector from the UK to Denmark, then that has implications for the Danish electricity system. I'd probably say it's a net positive for the Danish electricity system if you don't build it, because otherwise your electricity prices will probably rise a little bit. But anyway, that's a slightly different discussion, but it's just worth flagging that. So what are the key issues for Brexit and leaving the EU? So as Dorte mentioned, safeguards, and this is the one that is most troubling from the UK. So safeguards, there is an international safeguards regime overseen by the International Atomic Energy Agency, and as part of the agreement under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, countries said, you give us civil nuclear power and we promise not to divert that and build nuclear weapons. And that is the foundation of the whole regime. And underneath that is the International Atomic Energy Agency that verifies that process, that ensures that materials and equipment designed for civilian use are not used for military use. So that's the regime. And within the EU, Euratom undertakes safeguards on behalf of the international community. So across the EU, you have Euratom safeguards inspectors who go around ensuring that within all member states you don't have this diversion of material. So as the UK leaves, we now have to get our own safeguards agency in place. And in theory, that's not too complicated, but it is a significant number of different steps that have to be done in a short period of time. And so the first one, so in March 2018, the government informed the International Atomic Energy Agency that they wanted to have this voluntary agreement, offer agreement, along with an additional protocol. So they wanted to say we are going to be part of the International Safeguards Agency. And it was actually agreed, it was agreed earlier this week. So the board of the International Atomic Energy Agency agreed this to have this arrangement. So step 1 has been done. The IEA have agreed this. The next step is the UK needs to put in place its own safeguards regime. So up until now we haven't had one, and so there is this various figures about how quickly can we put in place the safeguards agency. And what in some ways the government has acknowledged, as well as the regulator has acknowledged, is that by the time we leave the EU, we will have in place a safeguards regime that is good enough for the international requirements, good enough for the IAEA, but isn't as good as that they had in the EU. So they're saying, well, we hope to get most of the staff in place, but there's not that many safeguards inspectors that you can hire, but they need to hire them, they need to train them, they need to put them in place. So they say we will get there in the end. And in some ways, this is also a potential issue around the transition. So if there is a transitional arrangement, then we assume that they will have longer to get these safeguards inspectors in place. So you have this, and then you have a domestic legislation that's going through Parliament in order to try and put all of that in place. And once you have domestic legislation, then you have underneath that all the implementation acts. So as I said, it's a very complicated issue. It's incredibly important. If we don't have the safeguards agency in place, therefore the UK cannot sign the international agreements. So as I mentioned, you can't have, unless you have that in place, you can't sign international agreements with other countries. The most significant for the EU and the UK are Australia, Canada, Japan and the US. The UK government says they are having these negotiations and that these will be presented to the Parliament sometime in 2018. But probably the other thing to understand, again, it gets so complicated. We have the domestic process, but then within each of these different governments, they have their own legislative process in terms of them reaching the agreement. So within the US Senate, you have to have what's called a 1-2-3 agreement, so this is the formal name of it, in front of the legislature for a set number of days before it can be adopted. So even if they think we can just take the EU legislation, apply it to the UK, everything will be fine, it isn't that simple. It has to go through various other processes. So again, a complicated business, and unless we have that put in place before we leave the EU, then the trade in nuclear materials will have to stop to the UK. We become a pariah state. Similar to North Korea, probably, I think, is the status. So those are some of the complications around safeguards and international agreements. Research and development was mentioned in the first presentation. So yeah, the issue is, will the UK, as of Switzerland, as of Ukraine, want to be part of the Euratom research and development programs? And there's probably every indication that it will like to. But like many of these other things, it's now going to have to buy its way in. So it will cost it probably quite a lot of money. As we saw, the ITER budget has gone up significantly. So maybe if we'd bought in 10 years ago, it would have been cheaper. But now, as the prices go up, so the price of entry will go up. If we were to keep roughly our stake in similar lines that we have now, it probably cost us €1 billion to buy into the ITER program. So we'll have to see. It really is a significant negotiation. And fusion is particularly important for the UK because we have the predecessor of the ITER, the JET facility, based in the UK. And we have to see whether or not this will continue. Skills, it was worth mentioning. So Dorte mentioned that there is under the Euratom Treaty a right for the freedom of movement of nuclear workers. If you look at the industry's asks for post-Euratom, they're asking for special status for the nuclear workers so that they still have freedom of movement. I think this is unlikely, given it was one of the key issues around the referendum. But it is a particularly important question. Not so much for operation, but the UK has very ambitious plans to build nuclear power plants. So it has been mentioned, Hinkley Point C is owned by EDF. It's officially not under construction, although they've been working out there for 2 or 3 years. They've spent €3 billion or £3 billion to date, but it's not declared as construction started. I believe that's because they want to get as far as they can before it's declared as under construction in order to be able to finish it in 5 years. So it's a tactic to ensure it's built on time. But in terms of skills, EDF says that in terms of the steel fitters, so the people that are doing the welding, they require half the steel fitters in the UK in order to build Hinkley. So if they can't have immigration, then the price that you can charge if you're a steel fitter is going to go up in the next few years. So yeah, it will just increase the construction prices. So it's a significant area of being able to access skills, in particular during key construction time. I mentioned the Safeguards Bill. This is just an important bit. It's just worth mentioning that next week is an interesting discussion in the UK Parliament. So they are going to discuss the future, how we leave the EU legislation. And the House of Lords, so the upper house, has sent down 13 areas in which it said it wants changes to the government's bill. And some of these are politically very highly charged, about the customs unions, about the right of Parliament. But one of these is around Euratom. So again, it just indicates that Euratom is not forgotten within the parliamentary process, and we'll have to see whether or not that is adopted. But mainly, I don't know, I missed out another slide. So, just the final point is, as the UK leaves the EU, so the UK has been an important advocate of nuclear power. And as Dorte mentioned, the question, in some ways, the balance is shifting. At the moment, there are 14 states of the 28 that have nuclear power plants, and there's 14 states that don't have nuclear power plants. And so, as we leave, in votes where there is a question of the simple majority requirement, then that balance has shifted. So it will be 14 to 13. So 13 non-nuclear states, 14 non-nuclear states, 13 nuclear states. But in reality, it's not that simple. You can't just say from a nuclear perspective, do you have a nuclear power plant? If so, you'll vote this way. And so I've just done this rough diagram. And it, basically, I think we can be fairly safe that you have the non-nuclear states in the blue, and that's 43% of member states. You then have existing countries that have existing nuclear power plants or have recently had them, and I put those in a group which is like Belgium, Germany, Lithuania, Netherlands, Slovenia, Spain and Sweden, that are to varying degrees sympathetic to nuclear depending on the topic. So if it was around decommissioning, they might vote with it. If it was around construction, giving new subsidies for nuclear, they might vote against it. So they're a bit in the middle. And then you have those that are really actively supporting nuclear power and that would really push for these legislation. So if you then look at how this might work, so it's the graph here on the right. So it's if you take these three categories, and unfortunately this is the wrong version of the slide. This final slide is where it says non-nuclear, that it should be actively nuclear. So the one on the right, where you have the green as 36, the number represents those actively supporting nuclear power. It's the wrong way up. So it should be actively supporting nuclear power, just have nuclear power, and non-nuclear at the bottom. So, but this line across the middle is this qualified majority of the population. So where you have qualified majority voting decisions is both based on one country, one vote, but also on the percentage of your country's population of the EU. So as the UK leaves, being an active supporter of nuclear power, being a large member state with a large population, it's going to shift that percentage. And this, I think, becomes important where, in order to have a qualified majority decision, you need to have 65% of the population in favour of it. And so around the questions, it will be significantly more difficult for those countries that are actively supporting nuclear power to block proposals from those that are less supportive of nuclear power. And that is a shift from what we have today. And so it doesn't affect the questions about the institution and the conventional reform that was mentioned where you need unanimity, but it may make a difference in terms of the day-to-day running of Euratom in the Council going forward. So, as I said, I'm sorry I got that slide. I did change it, and I obviously loaded the wrong one onto there. So if you want a copy of the right slide pack, then I will send that over. So just to conclude the final slide, Brexit has showed just really how complicated it is. More than 2 years after the vote, we're still waiting for the government to declare its position on a number of really important issues. They say that they were going to publish a white paper, and for those people that follow Brexit, it's supposed to be in the next couple of weeks, which will be a detailed sector-by-sector analysis or positioning of what they want. So we'll see if that really does come out. The UK is pushing hard to replace the functions of Euratom. Within the UK context, it hasn't had any debate in terms of the future of nuclear power whatsoever. We have an ongoing discussion about Hinkley and other reactors, but it has raised issues about how do we govern the nuclear sector internally, both in terms of safeguards, but also in terms to some degree in terms of safety standards, etc. Probably the biggest areas in which will have a short-term impact will be on research and development. What will we do? Will we buy into the Euratom framework programme? And if so, that's going to be expensive. Is that going to be a political issue? Maybe we'll see this becoming more of a political issue, a public issue, if we have to pay for it. And then the question of the access to skilled workers will become really quite important. But it may be worth thinking that, in actual fact, probably maybe the biggest effect of Brexitum may be on the rest of the EU, unlike many of the other areas, that this change in political balance could have significant ramifications. The UK really has been a strong supporter of nuclear power, and the industry recognises this, that this is going to shift, and so we will have to see if that happens. So thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you. So now we have a couple of minutes left for questions, and I will take the privilege as the chairman to put the first two questions. I will notice you. One question to Berthe and one to Antony. Berthe, you point out that a member state can submit a proposal for treaty change to the Council. Would you say that Denmark would be the best member state to put such a submit such a proposal, or which country shall we ask to make this proposal? That was my first question to Dr. Antony. Sweden has decided to go for 100% renewable, so we are really not interested in Euratom anymore. You have pointed out that if you leave European Union, you can leave Euratom, but if Denmark and Sweden now still are in the European Union, how difficult will it be to leave Euratom? Can you say something about that? But Dr. can answer first.
I would say naturally Denmark would be, since Denmark phased out, would be good to go ahead. I would not do it just like that, knocking at the door of the council. What I would rather suggest or like would be if the former signatories of this protocol, minus Hungary obviously, because I don't think they're very much keen at the moment to do a Euratom reform in view of their nuclear new build program. But so I would say Denmark, Austria, Germany, Sweden, Ireland, Italy, or so they should create an internal preparatory exchange conference, and from that, and they should immediately also do that together with parts of their parliaments, for example, to make it a very structured approach. I think we do not need to wait now for one. If one, then the most recent who has promised something to its population in the governmental coalition treaties, Germany. So.
Okay,
yeah, I mean, I think in some ways the situation hasn't changed. As we saw in one of Dorta's slides, the very clear linkage that exists between the membership of both treaties. So, yeah, I think what we see, and in some ways it's reinforced by Brexit, is that you leave one, you leave the other in terms of the treaties. And so the idea that it's possible to be a member of just one isn't the case. And I would suggest that it's probably not worth leaving the EU just to leave Euratom. I think there's probably enough benefits to stay in both, but we could maybe have that as a discussion.
Thank you. So my conclusion is that Denmark should take initiative to call for a couple of other friendly countries to have a preparatory conference before the member states submit to the European Council and to change the European Treaty. When it comes to Antony, I conclude that the most realistic way is to reform Euratom. It will be too difficult to leave Euratom as long as you are a member of the European Union. So anyway, you are welcome.
And my question goes on your future participation in Euratom. I got the impression from your speech that there's no opposition against British participation at all in Britain of future relationship with Euratom. Since there are two different treaties, why don't you just stay in Euratom?
I mean, I think one of my slides is there's a legal reason why you can't, there's a political reason why you can't, and there's a regulatory reason why you can't. So I think it's not worth, yeah, I mean, in particular, in terms of the approach that the EU is taking to these negotiations, it is taking a very legalistic approach. It is saying, this is what the treaty says, this is what has to happen. And so I think there was very clear advice from Brussels to the UK that it's not possible to leave the Euratom Treaty, to stay in the Euratom Treaty and leave the EU. And as I said, I think it's quite clear. I don't understand how it would work, in particular given the government's other demands in terms of leaving, not being under the European Court of Justice, not having to continue to pay money, and not be a rule taker. So for those political reasons, the UK could never do so. I mean, as to it being it's not a public issue. I mean, we are votes in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, there's parliamentary inquiries, there's all these other things. There's a very small bit of media coverage, but it's not a public issue at all. Euratom, obviously Brexit.